Hello and welcome to another episode of GM Talks. Today we're going to be looking at a game by Anatoly Karpov, the world champion from 1975 to 1985. He was a great player with a great prophylactic positional style, and I really was inspired by him when I was a young player trying to improve. Uh, Improving at chess is very complicated because it always goes in jumps and you don't know where to start and where to begin and it is not so easy to say, okay, I need to improve my calculation, and because you basically don't know what you don't know. The following game, where he won against Spassky in 1974, was a very inspiring game for me because I was before that very inspired by Kasparov and trying to attack and trying to get the initiative. And suddenly I realized that maneuvering and prophylactic measures was also important, and it made my game much better. And I started to try to say, okay, I want to play like this. I want to play like Karpov did in this game against Spassky. It was a semifinal 1974 in Leningrad. Karpov is white. And he begins with e4. He used to play e4 until he started to play Kasparov a lot. Then he realized that he was actually a d4 player, which was kind of funny. But you do what as your coach tells you to do in the old Soviet Union. And I think Kasparov's coach, I think it was Sak or something, or Zaitsev, was probably saying play e4. Spassky played all kind of things. Spassky is a bit of an underestimated player. He was very strong in the late 60s, as he was probably the first player in the world with a universal style. That means that he was both a good technical player. He could play endings, but he was also great at attacking and defending and getting counter attack and so on. So he was a formidable opponent for Karpov, but Karpov has always done very well against him. Also, Karpov was a bit lucky that he met Spassky after Spassky was polarized by Fischer in 1972 in the world famous match in Reykjavik. Okay, let's go on with it. The Sicilian defense, of course, this is for adventurous players who like on games with tension. And Karpov just played what he always did for the first many years of his career until he started to change a little bit. Uh, what we have here is the Scheveningen variation. I'm sure I mispronounced that. Uh, from some Dutch city. It's very flexible way for black to play, but nowadays black prefer to play a6 because he's usually play a6 anyway, the Najdorf, and Scheveningen is giving away a little bit too much ground from the beginning, especially since white has good results with d4, the chaos attack. But back then, Karpov always did bishop e2. Later, he switched to the chaos attack. Um, and they had actually played this variation earlier, in an earlier game where Spassky had won, but Karpov was prepared. F4, knight c6. And a good rule of thumb is for white in the Scheveningen with the classical setup like this is to answer knight c6 with bishop e3 and queen c7 with king h1. I can't remember exactly why, but it will work out, and you will not get into tactical problems with white if you do that. Bishop e3, bishop d7. Also, another rule of thumb is when black plays bishop d7, preparing to take on d4 and play bishop c6, you remove your knight. And if we're going to have a short stock here, we can say that white has more squares than black because he controls 4 rank and files here, and black only has 3. And then there's the 5th that we are fighting about. So it's a space advantage, and Karpov loves space advantage. But also, white has some problem with his structure. You can always say that because in the ending, usually e4 and f4 can get weak. And also the queen side pawns are something you can attack with a minority attack. But that's always all out in the future. a5. This is no longer played because of this square. So black gave up this line, but this was actually the way Spassky had won against Karpov earlier. So they didn't know that at that time. Um, yes. A4, stopping the pawn. Important. Knight b4, and this is black idea. He will try to get active play in the center, play bishop c6 and maybe e5 or d5. Bishop f3, covering the pawn, attacking the pawn once more, and the knight goes back, ready to take out the bishop. And as you may know, most people regard bishops as slightly better than knights. So it's like you gain 1/4 of a pawn when you take a bishop with the knight. G6, preventing knight f5 after an eventual e5. So black is preparing e5. Karpov is not scared. He has a very nice move here, rook f2. And here comes e5, the planned e5. And if, for instance, white had to go back to e2, probably black can play d5 and exploding the center and is in a good position. So he takes the bishop, this was his plan, and take, and now it's white to move. Okay, what happened? White gained the bishop pair. This is something we like. We like the bishop pair. Black has a slight majority in the center. He has an f pawn, and white has an isolated e pawn. But black also has a bad structure on the queen side. It may be good if you can get some sort of counterplay in the b file, but the knight on b4 is maybe not so well placed. It attacks c2, but apart from that, it's not doing so much. Also, when you get a bishop, the other bishop is, of course, the other party has a weakness on the white squares. It's a little bit like when you in a boxing fight and you knock out one of your opponent's teeth, then keep hitting on that butt. And so white is interested in dominating the white squares because he has a white squared bishop. Black doesn't have a white squared bishop, so he might gain a superiority in that area. And here white has a very nice move. The first of a real series of cool maneuvering moves by Karpov. Queen f1. It, of course, makes a sort of a cannon down the f file, but it also eyes this square, which is something where the queen wants to settle, attacking c6 and attacking f7, the weak squares in black's camp. Black would love to exchange the black squared bishop and leave white with a white squared bishop that cannot do anything. And he's, of course, very afraid that the bishop might go to e2 and c4 and attack f7, which will make it a very, very strong bishop. Of course, at the moment, it's not possible because he's attacking c2, but that's also why it was better to go on f1 than e2, because maybe the queen is not going to c4. Maybe you can play bishop e2 and bishop c4 and getting a very strong attack on f7. Black plays queen c8, starting to cover the white squares. This is a typical thing. And maybe he's threatening knight d4. Karpov doesn't like to have things like that hanging, so he prevented immediately. Also getting some air for the king, or luft, or what you would say. Knight d7. And if it was black to move here, he would go bishop c5 and exchanging the bishop and putting the knight afterwards maybe on e6 and d4 and getting very nice play on the black squares where black might have an advantage. So Karpov, of course, prevent that. Also, this is potentially a good bishop on c4, but it's also potentially a bad bishop that might just end up unemployed, unable to do anything. Also, the pin on the knight is very annoying and prevents bishop c5. Black decides he cannot tolerate the pin, so he resolved the problem immediately, but that also weakens his king side. The pawn gone sailing away there. He takes, takes, and bishop here, or queen here, attacking f7. We see that we have the rook and the queen attack f7. Bishop h4, defending f7, attacking the rook, and making some trying to get some more control over the black squares. The rook would like to stay on the f file, but the pawn on c2 is hanging, so it goes and attack the queen. Queen e7, and he's preparing bishop d5, but he decides that it's not good because f7 would be too weak after the exchange of the pawns, of the bishops. Rook f1, attacking f7 again, rook d8, and let's see. He would love to play the other rook, but he's afraid of bishop c5 in many lines. That can be a problem. So he has to go with this rook. And here it's white to move. And this is where my attention really got caught, because it seems like white is very active. He's attacking. But it's also clear that black has some structural problems, but also that he has potentially good chances on the dark squares. So what to play here with white? You get exactly 5 seconds. I think also a guy like Carlsen was inspired by this game, because this is something you often see in his games, is going backwards to go forward. And that's what happens. Go knight b1. And now we see that the knight on b4 is going to get kicked. And it's going to be kicked in a very annoying way, because it has to go to a6. Which is something you don't like. Also, the knight on c3 was dominated by the pawn on c6, but it would be very strong on c4 or f3, attacking some of the weak squares and weak pawns. So this is a very nice move. Also, we see that black has no immediate threat of any kind, so white is just in great time to do this. And black hurries to be sure to be able to withdraw the knight with knight a6, and maybe attack b2 with the queen later on. And this is very, very typical Karpov, getting the king out of the way. We also saw this in a lot of Kasparov's game, that he's in the middle of an attack. He just takes time out to make sure that the only king in danger is the opponent's. Here he's going out of any kind of checks, so he sort of frees the bishop on e3 to do whatever it likes. He also prevents the bishop from going to d3 and maybe f4 to exchange itself, or just to sacrifice a pawn to get some counterplay against maybe the e pawn. Black does the same. Also, it's a good idea to have the king on black squares, because that's where black is stronger. Also, he takes away the square h6 from the bishop. Now he kicks the knight, has to go back. And here's another thing. This is a very, very difficult question in chess. To exchange or not to exchange. Who will benefit from 2 rooks and who will benefit from 1 rook on the board? And Karpov sees correctly that that he will later be able to kick the bishop from h4 and then attack on the f file. So it's better to have 2 rooks, because black will be a little bit clumsy on defending f7 and e5. And also the queen has to guard a6, where the knight is just standing looking. So, whoop, just passive square, nothing to see here, and he's ready for knight d2 to f3, and it's coming. Notice that he cannot take on b2, because knight f3 is attacking the queen and the bishop, double attack. These sort of small tactics are everywhere in Karpov's games. The bishop goes back before it's kicked, but the knight still comes to f3. Another nice square would be c4, but Karpov correctly sees that f7 and the king is in trouble. So knight f3, attacking the pawn on e5, and f6. This is not what black wanted. And also we see that now more pawns are on black, and this guy down here, if he cannot be exchanged, you'll be a pretty bad bishop. Also, he doesn't help. He's colorblind. He doesn't help with the defense of these squares here, which are the weak points in Black's camp. So rook d2. There's a invasion square on d7 coming up, also preventing bishop b6 because you just take and give a check, and you cannot tolerate a rook on the 7th rank. So he has to remain passive. Here comes the queen. Now it's starting to get very seriously, and actually Black is completely lost already. Something like rook f7 is just met by knight takes e5, and the only move that makes sense but loses instantly is rook d8. You take, and here the interesting line is if he takes with the rook, because then white has to look very far and calculate very well. He took with the bishop, but we're gonna see what happens if he takes with the rook. So we gotta, and you take here, attacking f7. Cannot take back, then comes rook f7, and Black is completely lost. So, but he has queen c7, and we see that there's a pin here. So, oops, I'm making all sorts of. So we got rid of the arrows, and Black, white has to see actually that he can play this and take, and here attacking the min. He has to keep control of the queen side. Queen c5, e5 is terrible. Check, and king g8. And all this is actually forced. I'm sure that Karpov actually did see it, even though he was a very positional player with an excellent feel for the pieces. He was also a very strong calculator. He's of course still alive, so I shouldn't talk of him in past tense, but he's no longer a serious active player. He's mostly doing exhibition matches and so on. And here, boop, boop. And that's overloading here. The queen kind of has to go to f7 after for instance, this comes like something like this, and the queen is lost. Typical tactic. So he has to go here, and white is already threatening bishop d7 here. You cannot go to f7 because the rook is hanging, so he has to go here, and he takes here, and something like this, and white is winning here. Clearly winning. Takes c6, and all the pawns are winning. He took with the bishop, and that just loses because white shifts the focus. Rook d1, knight b8. This once proud knight is now sent back. Bishop c5. Notice how safe the black king. The rook has no good squares. Has to cover d8, so he has to go to h8. And here this just boom, and it's over. After this here. So after this move, Karpov won. Spassky resigned, and Karpov later went on to win the match, and he later also won against Korchnoi, and should have met Fischer in a world champion match that never happened. A big shame for chess history. It would have been a great match, a great matchup between two very different styles. But this was Karpov as a boa constrictor. I hope you enjoyed the game. It made a big impression on me when I was something like 16, 17, 18. And I really tried to play like this, maneuvering in this elegant way for the next many years. And I hope you're inspired too. See you later.